I'm Jim Moon, land law historian for the Bureau of Land Management.
And I'm Larry Pointer with the Phoenix Training Center.
In this series, we will trace the history of BLM through its land ownership.
We will visit public lands important to BLM's history and to its multiple use mandates today.
We will hear from Bureau managers and employees and analyze the elements that have shaped the Bureau of Land Management.
Join us as we review our fractured patterns.
Today, the Bureau of Land Management administers the remnants of our nation's once vast public domain. Fractured patterns characterize land ownership in the West. With some exception, BLM generally does not administer large blocks of land. BLM's management is further complicated by the intermingling of public lands with those in private, state, tribal, and other federal ownerships. Mineral responsibilities often include lands where the United States owns the subsurface, but for which surface title long ago passed into private ownership. These fractured patterns are largely a consequence of past federal land policies.
The term public lands is limited to those lands which today are administered by the Bureau of Land Management.
Alaska, while part of the public lands, is a special case. Historically, it has been administered separately from the rest of the nation's landed estate.
The fractured land pattern presents a complex challenge in public land management. With the passage of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or FLPMA, in 1976, the Bureau of Land Management became a new agency. It had clear direction to retain the public lands in public ownership, to manage them for multiple uses, not for the very short-term good, but for the very long-term benefits of the American people. Because of the intermingling of land ownership, the BLM is placed in a position of cooperative management with its neighbors, ranchers and private landowners, Indian tribes, state and local governments, and other federal agencies, all with quite different or single-purpose management positions. BLM's dealings with public land user groups also is unique because of its inherited land ownership pattern. Multiple use includes land and resource development mandates, as well as preservation and protection of important values. Flexibility is key to BLM's multiple use mission.
Beginning with the Land Ordinance of 1785, the national government decided to divide the public domain into a rectangular system of townships, ranges, and sections.
Beginning of the records for the federal land, or what we know of as the Western Territory, began when Congress first established the rectangular survey system. Congress, when they started to acquire the land in the Western Territories in the 1800s, had to develop a way of settling that land. When they went out and on top of a high knoll, they established an initial point. From that initial point, they drew a direct east-west line and a direct north-south line.
The east-west line was the baseline. The north-south line was the principal meridian. From that initial point, each 6-mile square was assigned a township number north or south from the baseline and a range number east or west of the principal meridian. Each of these 6-mile squares was further subdivided into 36 sections of 1 square mile each.
The surveyor would start on the bottom of the township, and he would work north, 1 section at a time, laying a marker at every mile and every half mile. When the surveyor sent his notes in, they drew 3 hand-drawn plats because they didn't have duplicating procedures like we have today. There's a lot of history there because when the surveyor was out there, he not only told us the distances and the coordinates in which to follow to reach from point to point, but at the end of his notes, he told us what was there, what he had found on his trails. And if you follow the survey pattern, you can tell when settlement occurred throughout the United States as the survey progressed across the western part of the states.
Unfortunately, America's frontier landscape, its mountains, its plains and valleys, was not very compatible with a pat rectangular system that looked so orderly on a flat sheet of paper.
Surveying the public lands, the fracturing of the frontier along township lines, has never been an easy task. The surveyor's life has often been fraught with hardship and danger.
I could see this bear coming down this where we had worked. Well, I didn't know what to do. So I climbed a tree that probably about 25 feet. And there was a couple of trees right close to us, so I could jump over and get over on the other tree if he came to me. He did come down, all the way down. I shouted and hollered. He just kept coming down and came down to the tree and got up on his haunches and looked up at me and finally wandered off. I gave him plenty of time to get the hell out of there before I came down off the tree. The typical crew was usually 5 or 6 men on the crew at that time, which is about the same as nowadays, although I think they're smaller because of the newfangled equipment. But you usually had 2 or 3 axemen to cut the line out, at least 2 in the mountains. You had what they call the principal assistant, and this is what I was for quite a number of years. He kept the notes, kept the measurements, and so forth. Then you had a drag chainman who was up ahead. Then you had a flagman and a surveyor running the show. Now that was a typical crew. Then to back it up, you'd have a cook, maybe assistant cook, and you would have a mule skinner, so to speak. Usually there was 2 crews in a camp. We usually used in most cases, a 5-chain tape. We used to have to cut our line through and blaze our trees, as it says in the manual. There's no doubt that our measurements and our bearings aren't as good as we have today with the new equipment that we have. For that type of work, at the time we did it, it's not bad at all, considering. At that time, we were the old General Land Office. One of the big jokes around the country was we finally got some trucks. Some of those old trucks that people wouldn't ride in nowadays didn't have springs, I don't think. You used to have GLO printed on the side of the truck, you know. People said, "What's GLO?" they'd ask us. We'd say, "Good-looking outfit."
Beginning with the Land Ordinance of 1785, Congress viewed the public lands as a source of revenue. The public lands were surveyed and then offered at public auction to the highest bidder. There was no limitation to the amount an individual could buy. At first, sales were handled by the Treasury Department, but in 1812, Congress created the General Land Office to handle the administration and sale of the public lands. The system favored moneyed interests and speculators. Much of the public land east of the Mississippi was alienated in large blocks, leaving only scattered tracts of public lands unsold.
The nation lacked financial means in the early years to help the states. However, the country had an abundance of land, and so Congress, beginning in 1803 with Ohio, began to grant lands to the states for the public schools and internal improvements. Beginning with Ohio, the United States began to give Section 16 to the states. Later, with other states like Colorado, they gave Sections 16 and 36, and then later with New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah, the federal government gave 4 sections of land to the states.
In 1862, to further aid the development of the states, lands were granted for universities, and thus the land-grant colleges came into being.
Grants also were extended for internal improvements, such as roads and canals.
Some of the more significant legislative grants that impacted the public domain were those made directly to the railroads. Beginning in 1850 with the Illinois Central and ending in 1871, Congress gave away millions of acres of public lands to finance the railroads. The grants were often enormous. The Northern Pacific Railway Company, for instance, received the odd-numbered sections within 40 miles on either side of its tracks. The railroad grants are primarily responsible for the checkerboard land pattern in parts of the West. The purpose of these generous grants? Incentives for development of the West.
While the government was selling large blocks of land to business interests, granting lands to the states and railroad corporations, there was also a concern for the small farmer.
The settlement laws for the small farmer were among the important determinants of the land pattern that the Bureau of Land Management administers today.
Among the first laws was the Preemption Act of 1841. It provided pioneers 160 acres at $1.25 an acre. The 1862 Homestead Act gave 160 free acres to settlers willing to cultivate and reside on their claims for 5 years.
The principles of the preemption and homestead laws were best suited to the country east of the 100th meridian, that magical line that separates the arid west from the more humid east.
To encourage farming west of the 100th meridian, Congress enacted other laws. In 1873 came the Timber Culture Act that hoped to bring rain to the arid west through the planting of trees. The law initially provided 160 acres to those willing to plant 40 acres of trees on barren land and maintain them for 10 years. Then came the Desert Land Act of 1877. As originally enacted, it granted 640 acres, an entire section, to individuals willing to conquer the arid west by means of irrigation.
But still the farmer's frontier stalled when it reached the doorstep of the great American desert.
The open-range cattle industry is a transplant from the heath and meadow of the old country. From the Massachusetts Commons, Carolina cowpens, the Florida Pine Barrens, and the Appalachian Piedmont, the crackers trailed their cattle westward. The cattle industry flourished in Texas and spilled on to the Great Plains, wherever free grass and water abounded.
The ranges were free to all. The business was a fascinating one and profitable so long as the ranges were not overstocked. And no man could say with authority when a range was overstocked.
The problems that became associated with free and unrestricted grazing on the public lands began soon after the Civil War. The Great Plains was ready to take on large herds of cattle and sheep and other livestock. It's during these years, right after the Civil War, that the transcontinental railway companies are beginning to push out onto the Great Plains. Refrigerated cars are invented to carry meat great distances. You have the Indian barrier being removed by the Army at this time. And probably most importantly, with increased immigration and as a result of the war and changing lifestyles of people, beef is becoming more in demand.
When the first big outfits came through, they established headquarters in specific areas and then claimed large tracts of land through the country, mainly concentrating on water, and then they branched out with their cattle from there. We found that the large herds, horse herds, cow herds, whatever they brought up with them and put on the range, had taken the range from a pristine environment to where they ate the grass off and took it down real low in some cases to where they really denuded the range.
As overcrowding on the range occurred, cattlemen and others felt that to get the best use of the range, they had to use it for everything that it was worth. You had no guarantee from year to year that you would have the range that you had the year before. And so there was no incentive on the part of cattlemen or sheepmen to try to preserve or improve the range that they used. At the same time, the dry farming movement was growing in the American West. And many homesteaders were moving into areas that were once thought only valuable for grazing.
By the 1880s, crowding on the range led to fierce competition for control of water and all the grassland within reach. Barbed wire fences sprang up to enforce the early claims.
Then came the winter of 1886-87, the great die-up from Canada to Kansas. It was a day of reckoning with the tally book for cattle barons and operations dependent upon the winter grass of the open range.
Along the streams and in the coulees, everywhere were strewn the carcasses of dead cattle. Those that were left alive were poor and ragged, weak. I wanted no more of it. I never wanted to own again an animal I could not feed and shelter.
A home base for winter with hay and dependable water supplies shaped the cattle industry by the turn of the century.
In Montana, at about the time of World War I, two disastrous events came together to force a change on the livestock industry in Montana. First came drought. Beginning in about 1917 and going as late as 1921, many areas of Montana experienced severe drought.
After World War I, agricultural depression hit. Beef, wheat, and other agricultural products plummeted in price. Many homesteaders and ranchers were forced out of business.
And another big problem was that there were so darn many horses, and there just wasn't feed for the cattle and that, and there wasn't water. The horses could travel quite a ways for water, but the cattle couldn't. So therefore, this thing that they called open range was something that you get for nothing is nothing, and that's what it was.
With the help of Congress, homesteaders and small ranchers quickly filled the void left by the departing cattle barons. In 1909 came the Enlarged Homestead Act that gave 320 acres of non-irrigable land to settlers. The Homestead Act of 1912 then reduced the time necessary to prove up on a homestead from 5 to 3 years. In 1916, the Stock Raising Homestead Act gave settlers a full section of land, chiefly valuable for grazing purposes. But even with these new amendments to the settlement laws, the life of the homesteader was not easy.
Dear Mr. Farr, I am writing you to let you know that I cannot pay the balance on Mrs. W.H. Reed account, as I have had no crop for the past 6 years, and I expect to pay it this year. But the drought took the crop, and the grasshoppers cleaned us of everything. I have been all alone on the ranch, but the past 6 months I am having a hard time to make a living. But when times pick up, I can, maybe some way I will pay it. Respectfully, Mary Murphy.
In 1917, I raised a fair crop of oat hay on 42 acres. In 1918, I don't know how much it yielded, as I was away to war in France. In 1919, no crop. It was a very dry year.
Not only was the rancher affected by the farmer's plow, so was the Indian.
The presence of the Indian on the frontier posed a major conflict with what was popularly seen as America's manifest destiny to settle the West. Early Anglo policy held the Indians' right to occupancy of, but not title to, the land. Before public land laws could open new areas to settlement, the Indian question had to be resolved. The Indian occupancy issue first was dealt with in treaties, then letters of agreement. In Texas, the answer was removal. Later, through the concept of concentration, Indians were placed on reservations. Then, a groundswell of protest at the degrading treatment of Indians led in 1887 to the General Severalty Act and the allotment of lands directly to the Indians. A two-pronged goal was behind this new development. First, to assimilate the Indian into the white society, and second, to provide for the opening of more land to cattle grazing and white settlement, a policy with disastrous consequences for Indians. The Indian Reorganization Act, passed during the New Deal, finally stopped the allotment process and the dismantling of reservations. These boundaries also have affected the land pattern in the West. Many issues have yet to be resolved in the courts.
Aside from grazing, agricultural, and timber values, the West also held other promises, a vast treasure trove of mineral wealth.
From the California gold rush, miners spilled up the drainages of Pikes Peak, South Pass, and Virginia City to stake their claims in search of the mother lode. Without a federal mineral policy, miners developed their own local laws, customs, and mining claim practices. In 1866, Congress passed a law providing for the development and patenting of lode mining claims on the public lands.
Early federal efforts at administering mineral lands proved to be a failure. In 1807, Congress provided for the leasing of lead mines, but the system failed, and by 1846, the mines were being sold to private individuals.
Congress was reluctant to enter the controversy of mining claims. There was no consensus on what to do. Some wanted to sell mineral lands at auction. Others favored either the preemption of claims or a leasing system.
In 1866, Congress enacted legislation to control lode mining claims on public lands. The law provided for mine claim survey by meets and bounds or landmarks, not by the rectangular survey system being used for settlement of the surface lands of the West. In 1870, Congress turned its attention toward placer claims and enacted a law to include all forms of deposit excepting veins of quartz or other rock in place. Claims under this law were limited to 160 acres for any one person or mining company and sold at $2.50 an acre. Claims in unsurveyed areas were patented by metes and bounds, but in surveyed areas they conformed to legal subdivisions.
The Lode and Placer Acts were modified in 1872 with the passage of what has come to be known as the General Mining Law. While the new act did substantially change the previous mining statutes, it retained the basic principle of free mining.
Today, the General Mining Law of 1872 continues to provide the basis of present federal policy toward locatable minerals. With metes and bounds for mining claim boundaries, fractured patterns continued to splinter in every conceivable pattern possible. Coal was another important mineral in the West. It provided fuel for homes on the treeless plains and for the smelters and factories of a growing industrial nation. Coal underlay much of the trans-Mississippi West.
The first coal land laws, enacted in 1864, 1865, and 1873, provided for the sale of this mineral.
Petroleum first was recognized as a locatable mineral under placer mining law. Then in 1897, the Petroleum Placer Act verified that petroleum indeed was a locatable mineral. At the dawn of the 20th century, federal land policy generally was one of disposal. Little thought was given to retention or administration of the nation's natural resources. Then in 1891, with the Reform Act, Congress repealed the Preemption and Timber Culture Acts. Acquisition of agricultural lands was restricted to 320 acres, and the policy of reserving forest lands was established.
Even though there still existed a basic policy of disposal at the turn of the century, change was in the wind.